You know, after 40 years on this bench, I thought I had seen everything. But on a cold Tuesday morning in November, a disabled veteran struggled through my courtroom doors. And what happened next made me question everything about how we show respect to those who've served our country. When I saw him trying to walk, when I heard what brought him to my courtroom that day, I knew I couldn't just sit up on my bench and pretend everything was normal. And when I made my decision, when I did what I felt was right in my heart, the entire courtroom fell silent. Let me tell you exactly what happened that day, because this is a story about honor, sacrifice, and what happens when we remember that some people have already paid their dues in ways most of us can never imagine. But before I tell you this whole story, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single word of this. I've been a judge in Providence, Rhode Island for 40 years. Every morning I wake up at 5:30, have my coffee with my wife Joyce, and I'm at the courthouse by 8:15. Christina, my clerk, she's been with me for 23 years now, and she knows exactly how I like my coffee. Strong, black, no sugar. She has it waiting on my desk before I even take off my coat. My father came to this country from Italy with nothing but hope and a strong back. He worked construction until his hands were rough as sandpaper. He taught me something I've never forgotten. He said, "Frankie, it doesn't matter if a man is a millionaire or a street sweeper. You treat him with respect. You look him in the eye. You remember he's somebody's son, somebody's father." That lesson, those words from my father, they've guided every decision I've made from this bench. That particular morning, I remember it was cold, really cold, the kind of November day in Rhode Island.
Buckle up, guys. Today we're going to witness a courtroom moment that challenges everything we think we know about justice. A veteran struggles into court, and before a single ruling is made, the judge realizes this is no ordinary case. What begins as routine parking violations quickly becomes a test of dignity, respect, and whether the system still knows how to honor sacrifice when it sees it face to face.
Where the wind cuts right through your coat, I got to the courthouse at my usual time, 8:15 on the dot. I've been doing it since 1984, and my body just knows the routine now. I walked through the employee entrance, nodded to Paul the security guard like I do every morning, and took the stairs to my chambers on the second floor. I never take the elevator unless my knee is acting up. Those stairs keep me young, or at least that's what I tell myself. Christina was already there with my coffee and the morning's case files. She looked up at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. I said, "Good morning, Christina. What do we have today?" She handed me the stack of files and said, "Judge, it's a full docket, 23 cases, but there's one I think you should know about." I could tell from her voice something was different. I've known this woman for over 2 decades. I can read her face like a book. I said, "What is it?" She pointed to a file about halfway down the stack. She said, "Parking violations." "But Judge, the defendant is a veteran, disabled, Purple Heart recipient." I felt something shift in my chest when she said that. I opened the file and read through it. The defendant's name was James Sullivan, age 67. The charges were 3 unpaid parking tickets over the last 6 months, totaling $450 with late fees. There was a note from the parking enforcement office saying Mr. Sullivan had ignored multiple notices. I looked at Christina and I said, "Do we know anything else about?"
From an outside view, the judge begins his day like any other, grounded in decades of routine and personal principles shaped by his father. When his clerk flags a file involving a disabled veteran, something shifts. The charges seem small on paper, but the context already feels heavy. Long before the man enters the courtroom, the weight of what this case represents is quietly building.
About him, she shook her head. She said, "Just what's in the file, Judge. But I saw him in the hallway earlier. He's got a cane. Looks like he has trouble walking." Something about that image, a 67-year-old veteran with a cane coming to my courtroom over parking tickets, it didn't sit right with me. But I had 22 other cases to get through first, so I put on my robe and headed into the courtroom. The morning started like most mornings do. A young woman who'd parked in a resident-only zone because she was late for a job interview. I could see the desperation in her eyes, the way she was trying so hard to explain. I listened to her story, and I thought about my own daughter when she was that age, searching for her first real job, making mistakes, learning. I said, "Case dismissed. Try to read the signs more carefully next time." She thanked me about 5 times before she left. Then there was an elderly man who'd gotten a ticket because his meter expired while he was in the pharmacy picking up heart medication. His hand shook as he held the citation. I looked at him and I thought about my father in his final years. I said, "Sir, take care of your health. That's more important than any parking ticket. Case dismissed." That's when I heard the courtroom door open. I looked up from the file I was reading and I saw him, James Sullivan. I knew it was him immediately because of the way he moved. He was using a cane, one of those 4-pronged canes that give you extra stability, and every step looked like it took effort, real effort.
As the courtroom proceeds through ordinary cases, compassion appears, but nothing prepares anyone for what happens next. The veteran enters slowly, leaning on a cane, every step demanding effort. The room falls silent as observers watch him struggle forward. It is no longer about tickets or fines. The entire courtroom feels the gravity of his presence before he even speaks.
The kind that makes you hold your breath watching. He was wearing an old brown jacket that had seen better days, pressed khaki pants, and a red tie. I noticed the tie right away because you could tell he'd put thought into getting dressed for court. He was showing respect. His face was weathered, lined with years I couldn't begin to imagine. But his eyes, they were clear and focused, determined. I watched him make his way down the center aisle of my courtroom. It took him almost a full minute to walk maybe 30 feet. Nobody said a word. The whole courtroom just watched in silence. I could hear the tap, tap, tap of his cane against the floor. I saw him grimace with every other step, his right leg dragging slightly. When he finally reached the front, he was breathing hard. Christina stood up to call his case. But I held up my hand. I needed a moment. I needed to see this man catch his breath, to let him have his dignity. I looked down at Mr. Sullivan standing there, and I felt something I don't often feel in my courtroom. I felt ashamed. Ashamed that this man, this veteran—
The judge pauses proceedings, allowing the veteran to catch his breath, a simple act that immediately sets this moment apart. From a neutral perspective, this pause restores dignity to a man clearly accustomed to enduring pain without complaint. The silence is powerful, and it becomes clear this is no longer a standard hearing, but a moment that demands humanity.
Who had clearly given so much for his country, had to struggle through my courthouse, had to stand before me over parking tickets. I said, "Mr. Sullivan, please take a moment. Catch your breath." He looked up at me, and I saw surprise on his face, like he wasn't used to being treated with patience. He nodded and said, "Thank you, Your Honor." His voice was strong despite his labored breathing. That told me something right there. This was a man who'd maintained his dignity through whatever he'd been through. I looked at my bench, at the height of it, at the distance between where I sat and where this man stood, and something inside me said this wasn't right. This wasn't how this should go. I made a decision in that moment that I'd only made maybe a handful of times in 40 years. I stood up from my bench. I heard a few gasps from the gallery. Christina looked at me with wide eyes. I said, "Mr. Sullivan, I'm coming down there. I don't think we need this barrier between us today." I stepped down from my bench, walked around to the front, and stood maybe 3 feet from him. I was at his level.
Breaking courtroom tradition, the judge steps down from the bench, removing the physical barrier between authority and defendant. As an observer, this shift is striking. Eye level replaces hierarchy. The veteran's Purple Heart pin and scars now tell a story louder than any legal argument. The balance of power changes, and everyone in the room feels it.
Now, eye to eye, man to man. I could see him more clearly now, the lines around his eyes, the scar that ran along his left jaw, the Purple Heart pin on his lapel that I'd noticed from the bench, but could really see now. I said, "Mr. Sullivan, I see you served our country." He straightened up as much as his condition would allow. He said, "Yes, Your Honor, United States Marine Corps, Vietnam, 68 to 69. I felt my throat tighten. I thought about my own time as a young man in the 60s, how I'd gone to law school while men like James Sullivan went to war. I said, "Thank you for your service, sir. I mean that." He nodded and said, "It was my honor, Your Honor." I looked down at the file in my hand. 3 parking tickets, $450. I said, "Mr. Sullivan, tell me what happened. Why are we here today?" He took a breath and said, "Your Honor, I have a medical condition, result of my service. I have trouble walking, as you can see. Sometimes I need to park."
The veteran explains his circumstances calmly, describing medical limitations and necessary parking near medical facilities. There are no excuses, only facts shaped by service-related injuries. Watching this exchange, it becomes evident that this is a man explaining survival, not negligence. The courtroom listens closely as reality replaces assumption.
Close to where I'm going. Doctor's appointments mostly. The VA hospital, physical therapy. He paused, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. He said, "The parking around the VA, it's limited. Handicapped spaces fill up fast. Sometimes I have to park in spots that might be violations. But I can't walk long distances, Your Honor. I just can't do it anymore." I listened to every word. I watched his face as he spoke. This wasn't a man making excuses. This was a man explaining his reality. I said, "What about a handicapped placard? Don't you have one?" He nodded and said, "I do, Your Honor. But these tickets, they weren't for handicapped parking violations. They were for expired meters and time limit violations." He shifted his weight, and I saw him wince. He said, "Sometimes my appointments run long. Sometimes I can't get back to my car in time. My leg, it doesn't move as fast as it used to. I used to be able to run 5 miles carrying a 50-pound pack. Now I can barely make it 50 feet. I felt something break open in my chest. This man wasn't..."
When finances are discussed, the tension deepens. Fixed income, medical costs, and family obligations explain why the fines remain unpaid. From the outside, it is clear this is not avoidance, but sacrifice continuing long after the war ended. The contrast between the dollar amount and the lifetime of service becomes impossible to ignore.
Asking for pity. He was stating facts. Facts that came from sacrifices he'd made for people he'd never met, including me. I said, "Mr. Sullivan, have you tried to pay these tickets?" He looked down at his feet. He said, "Your Honor, I'm on a fixed income, disability from the VA, Social Security, it's not much. After rent and medications, there's not a lot left over. I've been trying to save up, but every month something comes up. My grandson needed school supplies. My daughter's car broke down, and I helped her." He looked back up at me and said, "I'm not trying to avoid responsibility, Your Honor. I just haven't been able to come up with $450 all at once." I looked at this man, this veteran, this Marine who'd served his country in one of the most brutal wars in our history, and I thought about what justice really means. I thought about my father's words. I thought about the oath I took 40 years ago to administer justice fairly. And I knew in that moment that making this man pay $450 wasn't justice. It was the opposite.
The judge asks about the veteran's injuries, and the story of Vietnam surfaces. The courtroom is completely still. Observers sense the shift from legal process to moral reckoning. This is where rules meet reality. The weight of past sacrifice fills the space, forcing everyone to confront what justice truly means in this moment.
I said, "Mr. Sullivan, let me ask you something. Where were you wounded?" He touched the scar on his jaw and said, "Khe Sanh, January 1969, mortar attack. Shrapnel got my jaw, my leg, my shoulder. I spent 8 months in recovery. They put me back together pretty good, but some things don't heal all the way." The courtroom was completely silent. I could feel everyone holding their breath. I said, "Mr. Sullivan, I'm looking at these tickets. I'm looking at you, and I'm thinking about what you've already paid, what you've already sacrificed." I paused because I needed to get my words exactly right. I said, "You've paid enough, more than enough. These tickets, these fines, they're dismissed, all of them. You don't owe this city a single penny. Not today, not ever, not for this." Now let me pause here for just a second. I need to ask you something. Have you ever met someone who truly understood sacrifice? someone who never asked for special treatment but deserved it more than anyone. Leave me a comment because I actually read them. And if you're enjoying this story,
the ruling lands quietly but powerfully. All tickets are dismissed. From an external perspective, the decision is not dramatic, yet its impact is overwhelming. The veteran's reaction is raw and restrained, reflecting a man unaccustomed to receiving grace. The courtroom absorbs the significance of what just happened.
Hit that like button for me. I watched Mr. Sullivan's face as my words registered, his eyes filled with tears. He said, "Your Honor, I don't know what to say." His voice cracked. I said, "You don't need to say anything, sir. Your service says it all. But let me do something else." I turned to Christina and said, "Christina, call parking enforcement. I want to speak to the director." She nodded and picked up the phone. I turned back to Mr. Sullivan and said, "I'm going to make sure you get a special permit, something that gives you grace periods at meters, something that helps you when your appointments run long. This is something I should have thought of before you ever had to come here." Mr. Sullivan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He said, "Your Honor, that's very kind, but I don't need special treatment." And that's when I knew for certain what kind of man stood before me. I said, "Mr. Sullivan, it's not special treatment, it's just treatment. It's recognizing that not everyone's circumstances are the same. You've earned consideration whether you think so or not." He stood there silent for a moment, and then he said, "Can I shake your hand, Your Honor?" I reached out immediately.
The judge goes further, contacting parking enforcement to prevent future hardship. Watching this unfold, it is clear this is not favoritism, but foresight. The system adapts instead of punishes. The veteran's humility, even in relief, reinforces why compassion was warranted in the first place.
Gripped his hand. His handshake was still strong, still firm, the handshake of a Marine. As he turned to leave, I watched him make that long walk back up the aisle. Tap, tap, tap went his cane. I stood there and I watched every single step, and I made myself watch because I needed to remember. I needed to remember what sacrifice looks like. I needed to remember that the law isn't just about rules and fines and citations. It's about people. It's about seeing people, really seeing them. When Mr. Sullivan reached the door, he turned back and gave me a nod. I nodded back, and then he was gone. I walked back to my bench, but I didn't sit down right away. I stood there for a moment looking out at the faces in my courtroom. I saw a young man in the back wiping his eyes. I saw an older woman nodding her head. I saw my clerk, Christina, with her hand over her heart. I said, "We're going to take a 15-minute recess. I need a moment." I went back to my chambers and I sat at my desk and I just breathed. I thought about my father. I thought about all the veterans I've known in my life. My uncle Giuseppe, who served in World War II. My neighbor's son, who came back from Iraq.
As the veteran leaves, the courtroom remains quiet, processing what they witnessed. The judge calls a recess, acknowledging the emotional weight of the moment. Observers see faces changed, perspective shifted. This was not entertainment or procedure. It was a reminder of why justice must sometimes slow down to see clearly.
With injuries you couldn't see but were just as real. Christina came in after a few minutes. She said, "Judge, that was beautiful. What you did for Mr. Sullivan." I looked up at her and I said, "Christina, I didn't do enough. He should never have had to come here in the first place." She sat down in the chair across from my desk and said, "But you saw him. You really saw him. That matters." "I know it does." I nodded and said, "I hope so. I really hope so." She handed me a fresh cup of coffee and said, "The parking director called back. He's coming over this afternoon to discuss the special permit." He sounded eager to help. That made me feel a little better. I went back out for the afternoon session. More cases, more stories. A man who'd gotten multiple tickets because he'd been parking illegally while visiting his sick wife in the hospital. I thought about Mr. Sullivan. I thought about how many people are out there struggling with circumstances beyond their control. I reduced his fines to something manageable. A woman who...
News of the moment spreads quickly. From the outside, attention turns away from the judge and toward the meaning of the act. Donations begin pouring in, not for praise, but for veterans like the one who stood there that morning. A single decision sparks a wider response rooted in shared values.
Who'd parked in a loading zone because her child was having an asthma attack and she needed to get to the emergency room. I looked at her and I thought about the panic of a mother trying to save her child. Case dismissed. Take care of your little one. Around 3 o'clock, the parking enforcement director came to my chambers. His name was Michael Torres, and he'd been running the department for maybe 10 years. I'd worked with him on various issues over the years. He was a good man, someone who genuinely cared about doing his job right. He sat down and I told him about Mr. Sullivan. I said, Michael, we need to do better. We have veterans, disabled people, folks with circumstances we don't know about, and we're hitting them with fines they can't pay for violations that come from legitimate hardships. He listened carefully and said, Judge, you're right. What do you suggest? We spent the next hour working it out. We created what we called a hardship review process. Anyone who received a parking ticket could apply for review if they had medical conditions, disability, or financial hardship. We'd look at each case individually.
A Veterans Assistance Fund is created, turning one courtroom decision into lasting impact. Observers see a ripple effect as systems begin correcting themselves. What started as parking tickets becomes a lifeline for many. The story grows beyond one man, representing countless others facing similar struggles.
We'd be human about it. Michael said he'd need to get approval from the city council, but he thought they'd support it. He said, Judge, I think this is overdue. I've been wanting to implement something like this, but I needed the push. Thank you for pushing. I shook his hand and said, thank you for being open to it. That's what makes the difference. That evening I went home and told Joyce about my day. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table we've had for 30 years, and I told her about Mr. Sullivan, about watching him walk with that cane, about the Purple Heart pin, about dismissing his tickets and the look in his eyes. Joyce reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She said, Frank, this is why you do what you do. This is why you've stayed on that bench for 40 years when you could have retired. Because you see people. She had tears in her eyes. She said, I'm proud of you. I squeezed her hand back and said, I just wish I could do more. The next morning I got to the courthouse at my usual time. Christina met me at my chambers with my coffee and a smile. She said, Judge, you need to see this. She handed me her phone, and on
a letter arrives revealing the veterans' heroism in war, saving lives under fire. From a third-party view, this adds depth to an already powerful story. The man seen as frail in court once carried others to safety. The contrast is sobering and reframes everything that came before.
The screen was a news article. The headline read, Judge steps down from bench to help disabled veteran. Someone in the courtroom had written about what happened. The article described Mr. Sullivan's struggle to walk, my decision to come down from the bench, the dismissal of his tickets. At the bottom was a quote from Mr. Sullivan himself. He said, Judge Caprio restored my faith in the system. He treated me with dignity. He saw me as a person, not just a case number. I felt my eyes get wet reading those words. Christina said, Judge, it's all over social media. People are sharing it everywhere. My phone's been ringing since 6 this morning. News stations want to interview you. I shook my head and said, no interviews. This isn't about me getting attention. This is about doing what's right. She nodded and said, I figured you'd say that. But Judge, people are inspired. They're talking about how we treat our veterans, how we need to do better. That's a good thing. I sat down at my desk and said, then that's the story that should be told, not about me.
The judge reaches out personally, and their conversation reveals quiet humility on both sides. Observers sense mutual respect rather than authority. The veteran speaks not of heroism, but duty. This exchange reinforces the idea that true character rarely announces itself.
But about the James Sullivans of the world, about what they've sacrificed and how we need to honor that. Over the next few days, something unexpected happened. Donations started coming in. People from all over the country sent money designated for veterans dealing with parking fines or legal fees. By the end of the week, we had raised over $30,000. I worked with Michael Torres and some veterans organizations to set up a fund. We called it the James Sullivan Veterans Legal Assistance Fund. It would help veterans pay fines, get legal representation, and navigate systems that were often confusing and overwhelming. When I called Mr. Sullivan to tell him, he was speechless. He finally said, "Your Honor, I don't know what I did to deserve this." I said, "Mr. Sullivan, you served. That's what you did. That's more than enough." I'm going to be honest with you. At this point, I was overwhelmed by the response. If you've ever felt that sense of community coming together for something good, you know what I'm talking about. Hit that like button if you're still with me, and make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next really touched my heart in ways I didn't expect. About 2 weeks after,
the veteran is invited back to court, not as a defendant, but as a guest. Watching this unfold, the courtroom transforms into a place of storytelling rather than judgment. Community members gather, ready to listen to a voice that once felt invisible.
After that day in court, I got a letter. It was addressed to me at the courthouse, and the return address was from a VFW post in Providence. I opened it during my lunch break. Inside was a handwritten letter from a man named Robert Chen. He wrote that he was a Vietnam veteran who'd served with Mr. Sullivan at Khe Sanh. He'd read about what happened in my courtroom, and he wanted me to know more about James Sullivan. He wrote that Sullivan had saved his life during that mortar attack, that Sullivan had been hit by shrapnel but still dragged Chen to safety while under fire, that Sullivan had refused medical treatment until everyone else in his unit was taken care of first. I sat there reading this letter, and I realized I'd only seen the smallest piece of who James Sullivan was. Robert Chen wrote about how Sullivan came home from the war and became a carpenter, how he'd built affordable houses for low-income families, how he'd volunteered with Habitat for Humanity every weekend until his injuries made it impossible, how he'd raised 3 kids on his own after his wife died of cancer, how every single one of those kids graduated from college, the first in their family to do so.
The veteran speaks about war, loss, work, and perseverance. His words are steady, honest, and unembellished. Observers see how deeply his story resonates, especially with younger listeners. This is lived experience being passed forward, not for praise, but for understanding.
Chen wrote, "Judge Caprio, you honored a true American hero. Thank you for seeing him. Thank you for treating him the way he deserves to be treated. Thank you for reminding us all that character and service matter more than rules." I finished reading that letter and I put my head in my hands and I just sat there. I thought about what my father used to tell me. He'd say, "Frankie, you never know what someone's been through. You never know what battles they've fought that you can't see. Treat everyone like they might be carrying a burden you can't imagine, because chances are they are." That letter from Robert Chen reminded me that my father was right, that James Sullivan had been carrying burdens I couldn't begin to understand, and all he'd asked for was a little grace, a little understanding, because he couldn't walk as fast as he used to. That afternoon, I asked Christina to get me James Sullivan's phone number. I wanted to call him personally. She found it in the case file, and I dialed it during my afternoon break. He answered on the 3rd ring. He said, "Hello?" I said, "Mr. Sullivan, this is Judge Caprio." There was a pause.
As he finishes, the courtroom rises in applause. From an external view, this is not ceremony, but collective respect. The salute exchange between veterans seals the moment. The law has stepped aside to let humanity take the lead.
And then he said, "Your Honor, is everything all right?" I smiled at that. Even after everything, his first thought was concern that something was wrong. I said, "Everything's fine, Mr. Sullivan. I just wanted to check in on you, see how you're doing." He said, "I'm doing well, Your Honor, really well. That permit you arranged, it's made such a difference. I can get to my appointments without the stress now. I don't have to worry about rushing back to my car when my leg isn't cooperating." I said, "I'm glad to hear that, sir. I also wanted to tell you I received a letter from Robert Chen." There was silence on the other end. Then he said quietly, "Bobby Chen. I haven't talked to him in a few years. How's he doing?" I said, "He's doing well. But Mr. Sullivan, he told me what you did at Khe Sanh. He told me you saved his life." Sullivan was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your Honor, I just did what anyone would have done, what any Marine would have done. We took care of each other. That's what you do. I felt that tightness in my throat again. I said, "Mr. Sullivan, not everyone would have done it. You're a hero, sir." He said, "The real heroes didn't come home, Your Honor. I was just lucky."
After the crowd leaves, the veteran reflects privately on being seen again. Observers recognize how powerful recognition can be. This was never about money or tickets. It was about restoring worth to someone who had quietly lost it.
We talked for a few more minutes. I told him about the fund that had been set up in his name. He was overwhelmed. He kept saying it was too much, that he didn't deserve it. I told him that's exactly why he deserved it. People who truly deserve recognition are usually the ones who think they don't. Before we hung up, I said, "Mr. Sullivan, would you do me a favor? Would you come back to my courtroom sometime? Not for a case, just to visit. I'd like to introduce you to some people. I'd like people to hear your story." He hesitated and then said, "If you think it would help, Your Honor, I'd be honored." Before I tell you about that visit, let me ask you this. Do you think we do enough for our veterans? Do you think we honor their sacrifice the way we should? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you believe we need to do better, if you think stories like this matter, hit that subscribe button. I arranged for Mr. Sullivan to come to the courthouse on a Friday morning about a month later. I'd invited some veterans organizations, some city council members, some students from a local high school. I wanted people to hear from Mr. Sullivan himself. When that morning came, I was nervous. I'm not usually nervous in my courtroom, but this felt different. This felt important in a way that went beyond the usual proceedings. Christina had arranged chairs in the jury box and in the gallery. We'd set up a microphone. I'd asked Mr. Sullivan if he'd be comfortable sharing his story, and he'd agreed, though he told me he wasn't much of a public speaker. When Mr. Sullivan arrived, I met him at the courtroom door. He was wearing the same brown jacket and red tie I remembered from.
The ripple effects continue. Policies change. Judges reconsider how they approach cases. From the outside, this is systemic compassion in motion. One decision becomes a model, proving that fairness and empathy can coexist within the law.
That first day, his Purple Heart pin was polished and gleaming. I shook his hand and said, "Thank you for doing this, Mr. Sullivan." He said, "Thank you for asking me, Your Honor." We walked together to the front of the courtroom. I'd arranged for a chair for him so he wouldn't have to stand. I introduced him to the 50 or so people who'd come. I said, "This is James Sullivan, United States Marine Corps veteran, Purple Heart recipient, and one of the finest men I've ever had the privilege of meeting." The room erupted in applause. Mr. Sullivan sat down and adjusted the microphone. I sat in the front row, just a few feet from him. He looked out at the audience and began to speak. He talked about growing up in Providence, about joining the Marines when he was 19 because he felt it was his duty. He talked about basic training at Parris Island, about shipping out to Vietnam in the spring of '68, about the heat and the fear and the brotherhood he found in his unit. He talked about Khe Sanh, about the mortar attack, about waking up in a field hospital, not sure if he'd ever walk again. His voice never wavered. He spoke clearly and honestly. Then he talked about coming home, about how different everything felt, about struggling to find work because of his injuries, about meeting his wife, Patricia, who saw past his scars to the man underneath, about building a life, raising kids, trying to be a good father and a good citizen. He talked about losing Patricia to cancer 15 years ago, about how hard that was, harder than anything he'd faced in the war. He said, "She was my anchor. When she was gone, I had to learn to be."
The veteran finds new purpose teaching woodworking, passing skills and values to the next generation. Observers see service continuing in a different form. Though his body is limited, his impact is not. Purpose, once restored, carries forward.
My own anchor, but it wasn't easy. His voice cracked a little there, and I saw him take a moment to compose himself. Then he talked about his struggles with parking tickets, about how embarrassing it was to not be able to afford to pay them, about how ashamed he felt coming to court. He looked at me and said, "But Judge Caprio, he didn't make me feel ashamed. He made me feel seen. He made me feel like I mattered, and that's something I hadn't felt in a long time." The room was absolutely silent. People were crying. I was crying. Mr. Sullivan said, "I'm telling you all this because I want you to know that kindness matters, dignity matters. When someone treats you with respect, especially when you're at your lowest, it changes everything. It reminds you that you're human, that you're worthy." After Mr. Sullivan finished speaking, I stood up and addressed the audience. I said, "This is why I've stayed on this bench for 40 years, for moments like this. For people like James Sullivan who remind me what really matters. The law is important. Rules are important. But people are more important. Understanding people's circumstances, seeing their humanity, treating them with dignity, even when they're in front of you because they've broken a rule. That's what justice really means." I looked at Mr. Sullivan and said, "Sir, you've taught me as much as I hope I've helped you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your example. Thank you for being who you are." The audience stood and applauded. It went on for a full minute. Mr. Sullivan stood up with his cane and he saluted, crisp and military and perfect. Every veteran in the room saluted back. I saw young high school students watching with...
Years later, reflection replaces action. The judge considers what the law represents when guided by people who choose compassion. From a neutral standpoint, this story is less about authority and more about responsibility, about choosing to see rather than simply rule.
Wide eyes. I saw city council members taking notes. I saw Christina in the back corner wiping tears from her face. When the applause finally died down, people lined up to shake Mr. Sullivan's hand, to thank him, to take photos with him. He stood there for over an hour, greeting every single person, shaking every hand, never complaining about his leg or his pain. One of the high school students, a young girl, maybe 16 years old, approached Mr. Sullivan near the end. I was standing nearby and I heard their conversation. She said, "Mr. Sullivan, I'm thinking about joining the military. Do you think I should?" He looked at her with such kindness and said, "Young lady, that's a decision only you can make. But I'll tell you this. If you decide to serve, you'll learn things about yourself you never knew. You'll find strength you didn't know you had. You'll be part of something bigger than yourself, and that's a gift not everyone gets." She thanked him and walked away, looking thoughtful. I thought about how his words might change the direction of her life. After everyone left, it was just Mr. Sullivan, Christina, and me in the courtroom. I said, "Mr. Sullivan, that was powerful, what you shared today." He sat down in one of the gallery benches, clearly exhausted. He said, "Your Honor, I meant every word. You changed my life that day you dismissed those tickets, not just because of the money, though that helped, but because you saw me. You treated me like I mattered. I'd been feeling invisible for so long, like I was just taking up space. You reminded me that I still have value." I sat down next to him and I said, "Mr. Sullivan."
The veteran's passing brings grief, but also gratitude. Letters, memories, and stories confirm the depth of his life. Observers recognize that kindness extended at the right moment can shape someone's final years in ways no rulebook ever could.
"You've always had value, more than you know. I'm just sorry it took parking tickets for us to meet. You know what keeps me doing this job after 40 years? Moments like these, seeing that the law can be applied with compassion, that justice and mercy aren't opposites, they're partners. If this story is restoring your faith in the system, show me by hitting that subscribe button and that like button. Share this with someone who needs to see it." Over the following months, the James Sullivan Veterans Legal Assistance Fund grew. We were able to help over 200 veterans with various legal issues: parking tickets, traffic violations, housing disputes, benefit claims. We partnered with law firms who provided pro bono representation. We connected veterans with social services they didn't know existed. Michael Torres and his parking enforcement team implemented the hardship review process, and they reported that hundreds of people had applied and received relief. The City Council even passed a resolution honoring Mr. Sullivan and establishing an annual Veterans Dignity Day to raise awareness about the challenges veterans face. I started seeing changes in my courtroom, too. My fellow judges heard about what happened, and they started approaching cases differently, looking more carefully at circumstances, asking more questions, being willing to show compassion when circumstances warranted it. One of my colleagues, Judge Martinez, told me she'd dismissed tickets for an elderly woman who'd been parking illegally while caring for her disabled husband. She said, "I thought about what you did for Mr. Sullivan. I thought about seeing the person, not just the violation."
At the funeral, respect fills the room. Veterans, students, and family gather, connected by one man's quiet strength. From an outside perspective, this is legacy made visible. Service did not end with war. It echoed until the very end.
It felt right. That conversation meant more to me than any award or recognition. About 6 months after that first court appearance, I got another call from Mr. Sullivan. He said, "Your Honor, I wanted you to know something. I'm going back to work." I said, "Work? What do you mean?" He said, "Not full-time, but part-time. I'm going to teach woodworking at the community center, show kids how to build things with their hands. I can't do the physical work like I used to, but I can teach. I can pass on what I know. Your Honor, I'd given up on having purpose. But you gave it back to me." I felt my eyes well up. I said, "Mr. Sullivan, I didn't give you anything. You always had it. You just needed to be reminded." He came by the courthouse a few weeks later to tell me about his first class. He was beaming. He said, "Your Honor, I had 12 kids show up. 12 kids who wanted to learn. We're building birdhouses to start. Simple stuff, but you should see their faces when they sand their first board smooth, when they see pieces come together into something real. It's the best feeling I've had in years." I shook his hand and said, "Mr. Sullivan, you're still serving, just in a different way." He nodded and said, "I guess you're right, Your Honor. I guess old Marines never really stopped serving." I think about that day often, the day Mr. Sullivan struggled through my courtroom doors, the day I stepped down from my bench because sitting up there felt wrong, the day I looked at 3 parking tickets and saw a man's entire life of service behind them. My father always told me that the measure of a society—
The Purple Heart is passed to the judge, not as an honor, but as a reminder. Observers understand the symbolism. Justice is not about power. It is about seeing people fully and acting accordingly when it matters most.
Is how it treats its most vulnerable, its elderly, its veterans, its struggling families. He said, "Frankie, never forget where you came from. Never forget that everyone's fighting a battle you know nothing about. Be kind, be fair, see people." I learned early in my career that my father was right about everything that mattered. After 40 years on this bench, I still believe the law is the great equalizer. But the law is administered by people, and people have the power to use the law as a hammer or as a tool for justice. I choose justice every time. Justice that sees circumstances. Justice that understands context. Justice that remembers that behind every case number is a human being with a story, with struggles, with dignity that deserves to be recognized and protected. Money can't buy integrity. It can't buy respect. It can't buy the kind of character that James Sullivan has. And it shouldn't buy someone a pass while someone like him gets crushed by a system that doesn't see him. I've learned one thing in 40 years. The law doesn't care about your bank account. It shouldn't anyway. It should care about your actions, your circumstances, your humanity. In my courtroom, a nurse and a millionaire stand on exactly the same ground. A veteran and a CEO get the same respect. A struggling single mother and a corporate lawyer are both heard with the same attention. That's how it should be. That's what the robe I wear represents. Not power, but responsibility. The responsibility to see every person who stands before me as exactly that. A person, someone's son or daughter, someone's mother or father, someone who matters. The story of James Sullivan changed me. It reminded me why I became a judge in the first place, not to punish people, though sometimes punishment is necessary, but to help people, to be fair, to recognize that rules exist to create order and safety, but they should never be applied so rigidly that they crush the very people they're meant to protect. Mr. Sullivan's parking tickets were technically violations. He'd technically broken the rules, but enforcing those rules without seeing the circumstances, without understanding what he'd sacrificed, what he was dealing with, would have been technically correct and morally bankrupt. I told Mr. Sullivan something my father taught me. I said, respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn, and you've earned it in ways most of us never will. You've earned it through service, through sacrifice, through raising your family right, through continuing to contribute even when your body won't cooperate, through maintaining your dignity even when systems failed you. You've earned respect just by being who you are. He said to me, Your Honor, your father must have been a wise man. I said he was, and he'd have been honored to shake your hand. Later that afternoon in my chambers, I reflected on everything that had happened. The U.S. Attorney's Office had been working on the Veterans Fund implementation with local organizations. He explained how the fund was being structured to ensure it could help veterans for years to come. I learned that contributions were still coming in from across the country. People who'd heard the story and wanted to help.
In the end, this story asks a simple question. Should justice be rigid, or should it be human? From a third-party view, the answer is clear and the lives changed by one decision. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next video.
The numbers were significant, over $70,000 now, enough to help hundreds of veterans. All because one man struggled through a courtroom door and another man decided to see him. I sat there thinking about how one moment can ripple out in ways you never imagine. I thought about all the veterans who'd been helped by the fund, all the judges who'd been inspired to show more compassion, all the students who'd heard Mr. Sullivan speak and learned what service really means, all the people who'd read or heard about what happened and maybe treated someone in their own life with a little more kindness. One moment, one decision to step down from my bench and meet a man at his level. That's all it was. But it changed things. It changed me. 2 years later, I received a letter from Mr. Sullivan. He was in the hospital. His daughter had written the address on the envelope, but the shaky handwriting inside was his. He wrote, Your Honor, the doctors tell me I don't have much time left. My heart is giving out, but I wanted to write to you before I go. I wanted to thank you again for what you did for me. You gave me my dignity back. You gave me purpose for my final years. Because of you, I got to teach kids woodworking. I got to feel useful again. I got to feel seen. Your Honor, I'm not afraid to die. I've lived a full life, but I'm grateful that the end of it was filled with more kindness than I ever expected. Thank you for being the kind of man my father told me existed, but I'd stopped believing in. God bless you. I read that letter 3 times. Then I put it down and I cried. I cried for James Sullivan. I cried for all the veterans who never got the help they needed. I cried because I wished I'd done more. I called his daughter immediately. She told me he'd passed away that morning, peacefully, surrounded by his kids and grandkids. She said, Judge Caprio, my father talked about you all the time, about what you did for him. You made his last years better than they would have been. Thank you. I could barely speak. I said, your father was a great man. It was my honor to know him. She said, he would have liked hearing you say that. I went to Mr. Sullivan's funeral. It was at a small church in Providence, packed with people. Veterans in their dress uniforms, students from his woodworking classes, neighbors, family. I sat in the back, but his daughter saw me and insisted I sit up front. During the service, a young man spoke. He said his name was David, and he'd been in Mr. Sullivan's woodworking class. He said, Mr. Sullivan taught me more than how to build birdhouses. He taught me that everyone has value, that struggles don't define you, that you can keep serving even when your body fails. He taught me to see people, really see them, just like Judge Caprio saw him. At the cemetery, the honor guard folded the flag from his casket and presented it to his daughter. They played taps. Veterans saluted. I stood there watching, and I thought about that day in my courtroom, about watching him struggle with his cane, about the Purple Heart pin, about stepping down from my bench, about 3 parking tickets that led to all of this. I thought about how grateful I was that I'd paid attention that day, that I'd listened to what my gut told me, that I'd chosen compassion over rigidity. After the burial, Mr. Sullivan's daughter approached me. She handed me a small box. She said, my father wanted you to have this. Inside was his Purple Heart medal. I said, I can't accept this. This belongs to your family." She shook her head. She said, "Judge Caprio, my father said you honored his service more than a medal ever could. He wanted you to have it as a reminder that seeing people matters, that kindness matters, that justice is about more than rules. Please take it." I held that medal in my hand, feeling its weight, and I said, "I'll treasure this. I'll keep it in my chambers where I can see it every day." She hugged me and said, "Thank you for loving my father." And guess who started a scholarship fund with some of the remaining money from the Veterans Assistance Fund? Mr. Sullivan's daughter. She created the James Sullivan Scholarship for Veterans' Children pursuing skilled trades. She said her father had always believed in the dignity of work, of building things with your hands, of having a trade that could support a family. The first scholarship went to David, the young man from the woodworking class who spoke at the funeral. He was going to study carpentry, carrying on what Mr. Sullivan had taught him. I think about that day often, what it taught me, what James Sullivan taught me. My father came to this country with nothing. He worked construction his entire life. He taught me that every person has dignity, regardless of their bank account or their status. He taught me to see people for who they are, not what they have. After 40 years, I still believe the law is the great equalizer, but only if it's applied by people who remember that equality means seeing everyone's full humanity, their struggles, their sacrifices, their worth. Money can't buy integrity. It can't buy respect. It can't buy the kind of character that allows a man to drag his wounded friend to safety under fire. It can't buy the strength to raise 3 kids alone after losing your wife. It can't buy the grace to keep serving your community even when your body betrays you. James Sullivan had all of that, not because of money, but because of who he was. And I almost missed it. I almost let him just be another case, another set of tickets, another fine to collect. But something made me look up. Something made me really see him. So let me ask you this. Do you think I made the right decision? Do you think dismissing those tickets was justice? Or should rules be rules regardless of circumstances? I'm genuinely curious what you think. And here's another question for you. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have stepped down from the bench? Would you have looked past the violations to see the man? Or would you have stuck to the letter of the law? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I actually read them, every single one. Your perspectives matter to me. They help me think about these situations from angles I might not have considered. If this story meant something to you, if you believe in justice that sees people, if you think we need to do better by our veterans and by everyone who's struggling, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell icon so you never miss another story from my courtroom. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, someone who's been feeling invisible, someone who believes that character matters more than money, someone who wants to believe the system can work right when people choose to make it work right. And check out the next video on your screen. I've got another incredible story from my courtroom that you won't believe. It's about a homeless man accused of stealing food and what I discovered about him that changed everything. I'll see you there with another lesson about justice, respect, and what really matters in this life. I'm Frank Caprio. I've been on this bench for 40 years because I believe something simple. We're all equal before the law, every single one of us, rich or poor, powerful or powerless, veteran or civilian, struggling or thriving. That's what makes this country work. That's what makes justice real. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring about James Sullivan's story. God bless you, and remember, respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything, especially when you give it to someone who's been fighting battles you'll never see. See them, really see them. That's all it takes to change someone's life.